So let's proceed to classification of assurance engagement. So the classification of assurance engagement can be uh, grouped under two types, no? According to levels of assurance and according to structure. Okay? So let's take on the first one. So level of assurance. So classification of assurance engagement according to a level of assurance issued, no? Or given by the practitioner. So in this illustration, we have the engagement risk on the uh, vertical axis, which can range from zero risk to 100% risk. So meaning to say, the practitioner will issue incorrect conclusion at 100% risk level. And the level of assurance given from no assurance, so that will happen when we did not perform any procedures. So that is why if we did not perform any procedure and issue zero assurance, so it will result to 100% risk. So risk that our conclusion is incorrect. So but if we perform all the required procedures, so theoretically we will issue absolute assurance and the risk is zero. So meaning to say our conclusion is correct. However, in practice, we cannot provide absolute assurance. So because there are limitations in performing assurance engagement. So meaning, even if we perform all the required procedures, we cannot still provide absolute assurance. So because of the limitations that we will discuss later. So therefore, the assurance that we can issue related to assurance engagement is in between these two extremes. So one, we have moderate assurance. So moderate assurance will result to high level of risk. So because the assumption is that we will be providing or we will be performing less procedures and therefore the risk is still high. If we perform more procedures, so then we can provide reasonable assurance and the related risk will be less than high. Okay? So but not zero. So because we mentioned earlier that practically we cannot provide absolute assurance. So therefore, the level of assurance that we can provide is either moderate assurance or what we call limited assurance engagement and high assurance or reasonable assurance engagement. So if we perform or if we provide moderate or limited assurance, so it will result to high engagement risk. But if we provide reasonable assurance, then it will result to a risk that is less than high. So let's contrast the two classification of assurance engagement according to levels of assurance. So again, we have reasonable assurance engagement and we have limited assurance engagement. So when we talk about reasonable assurance engagement, so as illustrated in our graph before, it will result to high but not absolute level of assurance. So the high here is not the risk but the level of assurance. So the level of assurance is high but is still not absolute. Okay? So in the limited assurance engagement, so we will provide moderate level of assurance or limited level of assurance. Now, what causes the difference between the level of assurance provided? So answer, the amount of procedures performed or the extent of procedures performed. So usually in a reasonable assurance engagement, we perform more extensive procedures. So the sufficient and appropriate assurance evidence that we have obtained, so SAAE stands for sufficient and appropriate assurance evidence. So it involves understanding of the subject matter, performing of risk assessment procedures, determining the risk response, and performing further further procedures rather, no, not audit, no, further procedures because we're still talking about assurance engagement. So meaning to say, there's a lot of procedures involved in delivering reasonable assurance engagement. So that is also the basis of the high but not absolute level of assurance that we provide. Now, in limited assurance engagement, so the assurance that we provide is only limited or moderate because the procedures that we perform are less than, no, compared to the reasonable assurance engagement. So we perform less procedures, and therefore it will only result to moderate level of assurance. Okay, so that is why in reasonable assurance engagement, so the level of engagement risk is less than high or low risk, while in limited assurance engagement, the level of engagement risk is higher. So higher yung risk compared for a reasonable assurance engagement. And finally, in reasonable assurance engagement, we express positive form of opinion. While in limited assurance engagement, we express what we call the negative form of opinion. Okay? So whether the opinion is positive or negative form, that doesn't mean that positive is a good type of opinion while negative is a bad type of opinion. So both opinion can be both good in form. For example, both opinion can be clean. So but the way of expressing them would differ depending on the type of engagement. So whether it is reasonable assurance engagement or limited assurance engagement. So for example, the auditor issues a clean opinion, meaning unmodified or unqualified opinion or conclusion about the subject matter information. So, whether the engagement is reasonable assurance or limited assurance engagement, the practitioner can issue clean opinion, but the way of delivering the opinion could differ. So, one could be in positive form and another is in negative form. So, example of positive form of delivering an opinion goes something like this, no? In our opinion, the financial statements present fairly. So in this case, you are stating directly that the subject matter information is fairly presented. So in all material respects, the financial position of company as of a date and of its financial performance and cash flow for the period ended in accordance with a criteria. So you're directly saying that the subject matter information is fairly stated. So that is what we mean by positive form of expressing an opinion. In contrast, if you express opinion in the negative form, what you will say is that based on your procedures, nothing has come to your attention. So that will cause the practitioner to believe that the subject matter information are not fairly presented or not presented fairly in accordance with the Philippine Financial Reporting Standards in this example or in a criteria, no, in other assurance engagement. So whether this form or this form, so they are both clean opinion or unmodified or unqualified, but the delivery is different. No, in the first one, the delivery is positive. You are saying directly that the information is presented fairly, while on the second one, the delivery is negative. So meaning you are just saying that based on the limited procedures that you have done, nothing has come to your attention that will cause you believe that the information is not fairly presented. Okay, so because if you see this type of opinion, so that will signal or indicate that the practitioner did not perform uh, as many procedures compared to the positive opinion counterpart. So the practitioner in this case, in the second one, performed less or limited procedures compared to the positive opinion counterpart. So as for the example of reasonable assurance engagement include audit of financial statements. For limited assurance engagement, so example is review of financial information. So again, the difference lies in the amount of procedures involved. So there are more procedures involved in reasonable assurance engagement compared to limited assurance engagement. Okay, so third question. So now assurance engagements can also be classified according to structure. So here we have assertion-based assurance engagement, also known as attestation or attest services. And we also have direct reporting assurance engagement or direct engagement. So under assertion-based assurance engagement, so there is a representation by a responsible party that is made available to intended users. And normally, the evaluation or measurement is performed by the responsible party themselves. And finally, Under assertion-based assurance engagement, the responsible party is responsible for the subject matter information and may also be responsible to the subject matter. So, meaning to say, under assertion-based assurance engagement, so the responsible party may be responsible for both the subject matter information and the subject matter, or the responsible party is responsible only to the subject matter information. Okay? Now, under direct services or direct engagement, so there is normally no representation from the responsible party, or there may be a representation made by responsible party, but it's not made available to the intended users. So unlike in assertion-based engagement, the representation made by the responsible party is important, and that representation should be made available to intended users. So that's the difference from the direct engagement. In the direct engagement, there's either no representation or there is a representation similar to assertion-based engagement, but such representation is not made available to intended parties. So therefore, in direct engagement or direct services, the evaluation or measurement is normally done by the practitioner. So because it's usually that there will be no representation from the responsible party. So they did not measure or evaluate the subject matter against criteria. So it will be the practitioner himself or herself who will perform such measurement or evaluation. And therefore, under direct services or direct engagement, the responsible party is only responsible for the subject matter. Okay? So unlike in the assertion-based engagement, so the focus is on the subject matter information. So because it is the one that contains the representation of the responsible party. So another term for representation is assertion. Okay, so that is why it's called assertion-based engagement, because of the presence of the representation of the responsible party being made available to interested users. Okay, so take note, for the responsibility for assertion-based engagement, the responsible party is responsible primarily to the subject matter information. But in certain cases or in other engagement, so the responsible party is responsible for both subject matter information and the subject matter. Okay, while in direct reporting engagement, so the responsible party is only responsible for the subject matter. To illustrate, so we have here example of assertion-based engagement. So let's say an oil refinery company, an oil company is issuing a representation, no, a report or subject matter information. So that is both available to the practitioner and the intended users. So in this case, this is an assertion-based engagement. So because the responsible party made a representation, so that is available or made available to the interested users. So let's say the engagement is to measure the oil reserves of the company. And the company did the measurement of the oil reserves against a criteria. So let's say there is a criteria on how to measure the proven oil reserves of an oil company. And the company did just that. So the result of their measurement was contained in a subject matter information, a report. So a representation made by the company. And therefore, it was made available to practitioner and the user. So what will the practitioner do is to determine whether the subject matter information conform with the criteria and will issue an assurance report to the users so about his or her findings related to the conformity of the subject matter information against the criteria. Okay? So another example of assertion-based engagement is that it's also possible that another entity perform the measurement or evaluation. So let's say the parent company of the oil company or an engineering firm made the measurement or the evaluation of the oil reserves. So and then include it in the subject matter information or representation, and it's available to both the practitioner and the interested users. So because the subject matter information is available to the interested user, so that is still attestation or assertion-based engagement. Okay? Now, in a direct reporting engagement, the oil company, for example, will not measure their oil reserves and therefore will not release or issue any representation to the practitioner. So in that case, it will be the practitioner who will directly measure or evaluate the uh, oil reserves of the company and issue report, assurance report to the interested users. So that's why it's called direct engagement. So because no representation anymore from the responsible party, in this case the company, that is being presented or issued by that company. Okay? It's also possible that the company measures their own reserve, just like in the assertion-based engagement, and issue a representation or subject matter information. So, but the difference from assertion-based engagement is that this time, the subject matter information is not made available to interested users. So, it's just issued to the practitioner or provided to the practitioner. So, what will happen is that the practitioner will just include the subject matter information in its assurance report to the users. So that the users will be informed, no, of the subject matter information or representation by the company via the assurance report to be issued by the practitioner. So they will not have an access to that subject matter information directly. So therefore, under direct reporting engagement, it's still possible for the company to issue a representation, but it's not available to interested users. So that is an example of direct reporting engagement. Okay, so